Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to somebody who will explain how, in fact, the world got so insane. We need the expertise, the deep thinking, and the Renaissance-like mindset of Dr. Michael Hudson. Welcome to the Keiser Report.
Well, it's good to be back, Max.
I just heard some rumor you were in China. Okay, break it down for us. What's happening there? Trade talk, trade war? How's Trump impacting that country?
Well, there wasn't much talk of the trade war. There was much talk about whether it's going to go privatization route. You remember last year, for the last 2 years actually, there was a big fight against corruption. And the government's response to corruption has been probably the only response it could have taken, and that's bureaucracy. But then it finds that bureaucracy has really tightened up the government budget and the budget of the universities. I'm a professor at Peking University. And so they've looked for more and more partnerships with the private sector. Even for large conferences like I was just at, they needed private sponsors to help pay the airfares and bring people by business class instead of regular class. So there's a spreading reliance on privatization is the alternative to corruption. So what that does, of course, is to privatize corruption. And the big debate is over whether to let private banks into China. The American administration has been pushing to let the banks take off. And this goes hand in hand with what their real economic tension is, and that's the real estate prices there. Real estate prices have continued to go up almost entirely because of bank lending. And what I was trying to say, and what my friend David Harvey was trying to say, was to say, hey, you guys are Marxist politically, but how about looking at what Marx wrote economically? Volume 3 of Capital, where he talked about the self-expanding tendency of credit. And if you let American banks in, how are they going to get business? They're going to get business by lending to real estate, just like Chinese government banks do, and private lenders. But they're going to try to make easier terms, easier credit, lower down payment. And the effect is going to be to bid up housing prices all the more. And you're going to have what happened in the Shanghai property market occur in Beijing, Tianjin, Wuhan, and other Chinese cities. And this is going to create a bifurcated society. It's going to raise your housing prices and undercut your long-term competitive position, because you could say internationally, if prices are a reflection of wage levels, and wage levels are what it costs to buy housing and pay the banks for the mortgage necessary to get a housing, then you're going to fall for the Western finance capitalist sickness. Well, our arguments didn't get all that far, but the response we got was largely from the women. And the women all said, in China, if they're going to get married, they have to find a guy whose family has given him an apartment to start. Apparently, the women can't get, it's very hard for women to get salaries to pay. So I can see that China is following the Asian route of women getting paid much less than men. And that actually is the key to their export competitiveness. Because if you look at the assembly lines in Korea or China, you find the export industries, they're all women. They're not men. So you have a man having a high salary, buying the apartment, and able to support a wife or other women at a who earn such a low income comparatively because of the inequality that they're the export competitiveness. The export competitiveness is based on male supremacy, you could say. That's one problem. The second problem is that China wants to avoid a rural exodus into the cities. It doesn't want the kind of overcrowding that has led to slums in Latin America, Africa, and other countries. So what it does, in order to live in Beijing or Tianjin or other cities, you have to have a passport for that city, meaning you pretty much have to be born in that city. Well, that means that if students at Peking University come from outlying areas, from rural districts, once they graduate, they can't get a job in Beijing or an apartment. They have to either go back to their cities of origin until Beijing needs their labor, or they go to work for a institution like a university that has housing for its own employees, like a college or a high school that provides housing for its teachers. So it's very much like the old Soviet system used to be, where every company would provide housing for its workers, entertainment for its workers, and you're having this kind of segmentation of the economy taking place. And the question is, how are they going to break it down? They haven't solved that yet, but that is the main problem that they're working on now.
China, of course, entered the World Trade Organization under Clinton, and since then, the economy has expanded magnificently. They transitioned from essentially communism to capitalism with that deal, and they've had an uninterrupted run of growth. And what you're suggesting, and what I'm reading, is that they're now trying to figure out how to handle a contraction to that growth. And the playbook, of course, in capitalism, the system that they're emulating, is to let the losers die and don't bail them out. You know, in a pure capitalist society, of course, you don't see that in America anymore, but in the purest of a capitalist notion. Whereas in communism, of course, that would not be the case. So it seems like there's a split philosophically here. Now that they've had this big run, this enormous GDP expansion, thanks to inclusion in the WTO, now they're facing a different problem in their history, modern history. I see you shaking your head, so am I off base? What do you have to say to that?
I don't think it's the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that's been spurring them. China's path of development so far is almost identical to the American path of development in the 19th century and the German path of development and that of England before. It's a mixed economy. And the key to its mixed economy is the government takes control of the infrastructure and provides basic infrastructure services like education, roads, transportation, either freely or at a loss. It's the low-cost infrastructure that made America so competitive in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Now, the World Trade Organization is basically Milton Friedman, Margaret Thatcher saying, privatize everything. You can't have a mixed economy. Only the United States can have a mixed economy, and its mixed economy is going to be basically military technology and monopolies to make China and other countries dependent. So China has no intention of letting America dismantle its mixed economy. And right now you have the ideological attack from Washington saying, you've got to privatize your schools so that your students will have to take on a student debt just like Americans. And you have to privatize your education so you can have as rotten and expensive transportation system as London. And you can just essentially commit economic suicide. Won't you please do that and join the West? And China has no intent. China says there was a lot of discussion about we don't want to do what the Russians did, who had, because the Russians had never read Marx, they didn't understand capitalism and had no idea what was in store for them when they let neoliberals plan their economy in the 1990s. China has maintained a mixed economy with the public sector. So it's going to continue to do this. And as you can see with the fight over IT technology right now, it wants to be free of America's ability to create a technology monopoly to make it dependent. So you're having this political tension there of wanting to sort of avoid having a military conflict with the United States, Libya style or Russia style, while it's still trying to maintain the export markets to get enough money to buy the technology and the raw materials that it needs to continue growing. I didn't send...
Right. Let me jump in here, because you did say, though, that the government has come down on corruption, which in turn has decreased the GDP growth, which has then inspired the government to go to the private sector and invite privatization. And you're saying, of course, then you're just privatizing the corruption. I get that. So, but why wouldn't you then make the next step and say that they have a political and philosophical, ideological problem here because they've not experienced a wholesale collapse, not since the 1930s maybe, has there been a huge collapse in China. You know, and so how are they going to, if the people are in revolt and they have a history of revolting, I mean, how are they going to calm folks?
It's a trick question, Max. The slower the GDP growth, the faster the economy grows, because the GDP is a fake measure. The GDP doesn't measure growth. It measures how all the growth in America of GDP since 2008 has been the banking sector, the fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. It's a fictitious growth in the West. China has avoided fictitious growth, and it's pursued the kind of growth that doesn't show up in GDP, namely low-cost services provided by government investment that isn't counted in the GDP. So China does not follow a statistical measure of growth like the West does. In China's statistics, that are talking about real growth, their growth is continuing. It's not taking the form of construction like as it was before. It's not taking the American form of increasing banking. It's not taking the form of increasing debt service like in America. But I can assure you that the economy is continuing to grow just as it was before. But this doesn't show up in the GDP statistics because they don't follow the GDP statistics. They're designed by the financial sector to celebrate itself.
Okay, let's look at the other side of the equation here. Let's look at America. You, of course, wrote Super Imperialism. Many say that the U.S. empire is on its last legs. We've got a study out that top 10% of Americans are the new aristocracy, controlling huge, vast sums of wealth. Life expectancy in America is down. Infant mortality is up. Student debt's over $1.5 trillion. You know, it looks bad. We only have about a minute, but how would you characterize the American empire at the moment?
Fighting desperately to keep its control over other countries and to try to say that all the growth of other countries has to be paid to the United States. It's trying to do this by replacing the old kind of colonialism with a monopoly trade. It wants to monopolize all the high technology, all the finance, everything that other countries need for essentials in its own hands so that it can siphon off their growth to itself. And other countries are breaking away. China's breaking away. Russia doesn't know which way it's going to go. And we're seeing the tensions play out in Europe right now. When America's saying, don't buy cheap Russian gas, buy expensive American liquefied gas. And the Germans say, whatever you say, and the English say, okay. All
right, fair enough. It sounds like a good joke is in there somewhere. We're going to have to do that the next time. Dr. Michael Hudson, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Michael Hudson. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.